In this video, we will going to talk about some potential adjustment for GDP and discuss whether GDP is a good measure for our well-being. So the first potential adjustment is we need to adjust our GDP for prices. In the left figure, it shows the US nominal GDP, which is not adjusted by price over time from 1980s to 2023, right? So as we discussed before, to calculate the GDP, basically we are using the price of each good or services times the quantity produced, right? And add all the values across different goods and services, right? So we can see that from 1980s to 2023, the US GDP growth increased from more than $2,000 billion to almost $30 trillion, right? That's a very large increase, almost 10 times increase. But the question is that, is our economy really increased by 10 times of the in size? The question is not, right? So in the right figure, it shows the average price of a bread in the same time period. So we can see that the price of bread also increased by almost 4 times within the same period, right? So if price actually increased, even we didn't produce more goods, the GDP is still growing because the price is increasing, right? So if the quantity stays the same, price increased, the value will still increase, right? So, but we didn't actually produce more good. So in that way, nominal GDP is not a very good measurement for our production, right? So here we need to do some adjustment based on price. That's our real GDP. So for nominal GDP, it values the output using the current price, right? So it uses the price at time t times the quantity at time t and add them up. So it's not corrected for inflation. So over time, even if Q or the quantity produced stay the same, only price increased, we will have higher nominal GDP. For real GDP, to correct for that kind of price effect, it will value outputs using prices of a base year. So if you see here, we are using the price of some base year P0. That price is the same for every year, right, to calculate the values. So we are using the same price times the quantity produced in each year to calculate the values, right? So because we are using the same price for different years, the difference in this real GDP will capture only the difference in quantities, right? So that's the idea of this real GDP. That's how we correct for inflation, right? So by definition, by construction, in the base year, we should have nominal GDP equals to real GDP because they are using the same price and same quantity in base year. This figure shows the nominal and real GDP in the US. So we can see that the blue line shows the real GDP, red line shows the nominal GDP. So the nominal GDP actually is kind of overestimate our economic growth, right? Because it's steeper than the real GDP, right? So also in the recent times after COVID, we can see that the nominal GDP increased a lot because we were experiencing very high rate of inflation. The price increased very quickly during that period. So the nominal GDP increased a lot, but the real GDP doesn't increase that much because our output doesn't increase that much. So the main contribution to the nominal GDP increase in the last 3 years is mainly the price. Another problem is that GDP measures the whole production within the country. But if the country has a very large population, potentially it can have a large GDP, right? But it does not mean that people living in this country will have a higher living standard or higher income. So the idea to do this adjustment is we need to adjust based on population. So we'll calculate GDP per capita. Per capita means per person, right? So the GDP per capita will equals to our total GDP divided by our total population. So that GDP per capita will measure the people's income. So that will actually be equal to average income per person because GDP is our total income, right? So GDP per capita is average income. This map here shows the GDP per capita over the world in 2021. So the deeper the color, the higher the income. So we can see that North America and the West Europe and Australia, they are high income countries. And East Asia and South America, there are some middle income countries. In the sub-Saharan Africa, there are many low income countries. Right? So the question now here is that is GDP a very good or perfect indicator for well-being? Actually not. Here is some very eloquent criticism from Senator Robert Kennedy. He said, GDP does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our courage, nor our wisdom, nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile, and it can tell us everything about America except why we are proud of that we are Americans. Right? So we can see that GDP definitely is not a perfect measure of well-being because it does not include our leisure time, does not include our non-market activities like home production, even though these kind of activities are generating values, right? It does not include environment quality. It does not include mental health. All this kind of stuff will be related to our well-being, but GDP is not capturing that, right? But even with these kind of problems, GDP is still a good measure of well-being. Why is that? Because higher GDP per capita means higher income, right? If your income is higher, you can afford for better schools, better medical services, and higher quality of life, potentially, right? More importantly, GDP is positively correlated with many other indicators, even it's not directly capturing them. One example is the Human Development Index. So the Human Development Index is a summary measure of average achievement in key dimensions of human development, including whether you have a long and healthy life, being knowledgeable, and having a decent standard of living, right? So in this figure shows the relationship between GDP per capita and the Human Development Index across different countries. So the horizontal axis is the GDP per capita, and the vertical axis is the Human Development Index. We can see that there's a strong correlation between GDP per capita and the Human Development Index, right? So if the country's GDP per capita is higher, generally it will have a higher Human Development Index. This figure shows the relationship between GDP per capita and the self-reported satisfaction, right? Again, the horizontal axis is the GDP per capita. So generally, they are also positively correlated, right? So if you can draw a line here, right? So if a country has a higher GDP per capita, generally the people living in that country will have a higher level of satisfaction. And also, the same story for life expectancy. So if you have a higher GDP per capita, normally you will live longer, right? And also the similar story for average years of schooling. Horizontal axis is the GDP per capita. If you live in a country with higher GDP per capita, in average, you're expected to have finished more school works, have higher degrees, right? And all the other many other indicators like the annual working hours, right? So this figure shows a negative correlation between GDP per capita and annual working hours. So if you are living in a country with very high income, high GDP per capita, you will normally or generally you will be working less, right? So if you are working less, you'll be happier, right? Because you have more leisure time. And it's also correlated with your medical service access, right? So if you are living in a country with very high GDP per capita, you have more medical doctors, so it will be more accessible for the medical services, right? Even its GDP per capita is correlated with road incident death rate. It's quite interesting. So if you live in a country with a high income, high GDP per capita, the road incident death rate will be decreasing. Right? So in general, GDP is not a perfect measure. It does not capture a lot factors that will be related to our well-being, but still, it's useful. Even it's not capturing all the aspects, it's potentially correlated with these factors still. Right? So it's useful.